purple room. I just ruined it. Well, whatever. Too late. This is the purple room. Looks kind of green. We're on the second floor. And I'm going to do it on the second floor this time. I'm just going to stroll around. And I got a spicy article. It should be pretty good. And I was going to talk generically about a few things, because there's some other articles that I wanted to read, but I just don't want to get into it. Like, there's the Russia/Ukraine/ show trial thing that's going on, and then Adam Schiff, and, like, people's phone records, just kind of releasing the phone records of your political opponents. Doesn't look good, but then again, I think it is so outlandish and ridiculous that I don't even care to keep track of it, because I kind of hate everybody involved. So not going to talk about that, even though I do have opinions. I'm probably wrong. I don't know. And then, yesterday I was on, I think I made a video yesterday about being on a promenade and calling the Purple Room a promenade. Which I'm not sure it is. But I was on Deep Space Nine last night, and I was walking around that promenade, which certainly is a promenade. And I saw people hanging outside the security office, and one of them was holding a torch. And they were just standing there. And I went over and stood with them for a minute, and they said a few words. I couldn't tell what was going on. I said, "What is this ritual?" And they said, René Auberjonois, the actor who played Odo, Chief Security Officer of Deep Space Nine, passed away yesterday morning. Today is the 9th of December, 2019, year of our Lord. So, rest in peace. So that's a little bit of Star Trek news. Sad stuff. I know Nog, what's his name? Aaron something. The guy that played Nog. I can't remember his last name. But yeah, he passed away earlier this year too. 2 people from Deep Space Nine. And then, because I clicked on that, see, my phone gives me a lot of stuff. Excuse me. Yeah, there was another article that I was gonna maybe mention. Taking cues from my phone. It's a bad habit. Let's see. But don't worry, I got a good article here. Oh, the Who album. Who's dropping a new album? And I saw something at one point. What are these guys' names? Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey. I can't remember who was more in the creative control of putting out the album, but I think it was proposed that somebody's going to be rapping on this album to make it more contemporary or relevant, and I think it was Daughtry. He was like, "No, I'm not going to do that," and I think everybody appreciates him declining to do that. When you're an old man, preserve your dignity and do what you know. Don't rap for the kids these days or whatever. He refused to, and I thought that was a wise choice. But yeah, that was like a little article that's on there. And other generic news. Joe Rogan had this debate on his podcast between for the Game Changers. I guess it was a video. It had something to do with like nutritional health. And I watched like the first maybe an hour of it, and I found it very difficult to watch because everybody's like, "You're committing this fallacy. You're this fallacy. No, the data." And just not being an expert and trying to follow that. The person who was defending his work I found to be very unconvincing. However, I did not watch the full podcast. So, yeah, that's a thing. But apparently Arnold Schwarzenegger praised Joe Rogan's open mind following the podcast. And that Joe was actually persuaded by the defense of this person's film. So that's a little bit of news relevant to nobody. So there's a few other little Golden Globe snubs and surprises. Game of Thrones, female directors, blah, 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 blah. Some rapper that I've never heard of died yesterday, too. And... Kim Jong-un talking some trash. Yeah, so that's all the interesting. I'm going to stop taking cues from my phone, and I'm going to go to this article that I got from the paper yesterday, the Sunday edition of the Denver Post, and listen to this. It's a real newspaper, except I just clipped it out. I don't have the full paper here. But yeah, it's an authentic newspaper that I'm holding in my hands. Germs and sneeze and cough all over it. So once I'm done reading it, I am throwing it in the dustbin. The germ rag bin. But I'm actually going to go to the purple section of this structure. Here we go. Should I do the song? Purple Room. Here we go. The title of the article is Can Biology Class Reduce Racism? By Amy Harmon. And I remember I've already read this. And I just had mixed feelings about it. Because, I don't know. Some parts of the article I liked, particularly towards the end. At the beginning, it didn't start well. When people talk about these things, people are suspicious about them for different reasons. But anyway, can biology class reduce racism? And one quote excerpted. The thing to remember is that kids are already making sense of race and biology, but with no guidance, says Brian Donovan, science education researcher at BSCS Science Learning. So, this from Colorado Springs. Biology textbooks used in American high schools do not go near the sensitive question of whether genetics can explain why African Americans are overrepresented as football players and why a disproportionate number of American scientists are white or Asian. Ooh, strong start. But in a study starting this month, a group of biology teachers from across the country will address it head-on. They are testing the idea that the science classroom may be the best place to provide a buffer against the unfounded genetic rationales for human difference that often become the basis for racial intolerance. At a recent training in Colorado, a dozen teachers who had volunteered to participate in the experiment acknowledged the challenges of inserting the combustible topic of race and ancestry into straightforward lessons on the 19th century pea breeding experiments of Gregor Mendel and the basic function of the strands of DNA coiled in every cell. Ooh, that rhymed. It's pretty fresh. The new approach represents a major deviation from the usual school genetics fare, which devotes little time to the extent of genetic differences across human populations or how traits in every species are mixed shaped by a complex mix of genes and environment. Yeah, I feel there's a parallel here between the nature-nurture argument when you are raising children and you are tracking their development and their behaviors and what their capacities are. Some of those are informed by the environment in which they are raised, and some of them are based on genetics. For example, I was in a job training program, and they also had another program where they would help people get their GEDs, and I helped tutor people in math and language so that they could, write their essays or paragraphs or whatever, and also do the maths. And I can do a dive roll. Wah! And there was a person that I was working with, and I was trying to compare, regardless of the situation, they were not good at writing, and they were not good at maths. Neither of those things. And I didn't want to believe them. I wanted to believe it was like an effort or something like that, but I believed them. I did not think that they were really capable of doing a lot of this stuff, which was discouraging, but I think kind of a real thing. And who knows why that is. Maybe at an earlier age with more intervention, they could have been capable of these things, or perhaps, people are different, so that does put him at a disadvantage in a lot of ways. Anyways, back to the article. The new approach represents a major deviation from the usual... Oh yeah, I already said that. It also challenges a prevailing belief among science educators that questions about race are best left to their counterparts in the social studies. Yeah, I think they've kind of abdicated that responsibility. My goodness. The history of today's racial categories arose long before the field of genetics and have been used to justify all manner of discriminatory policies. Race, a social concept bound in culture and family, is not a topic of study in modern human population genetics, which typically uses concepts such as ancestry or population to describe geographic genetic groupings. But that has not stopped many Americans from believing that genes cause racial groups to have distinct skills, traits, and abilities. And among some biology teachers, there has been a growing sense that avoiding any direct mention of race in their genetics curriculum may be backfiring. Yeah, I feel like if you ignore it, if we refer to the nature-nurture, I don't know if it's going to be helpful for me to refer to things in that manner, but I think there is a striking parallel personally, so I'll just use it. Today, it is very fashionable to say that everything can change if we just nurture it, that there is no innate qualities that humans have. It's all socialization, and if we just engineer society in the right way, we can make humans whatever we want them to be. And that seems to be very popular, especially from the influence of these social studies people. And I feel like that is why it's backfiring, because a lot of people are like, yeah, but you're kind of neglecting, even if it makes you uncomfortable to talk about innate characteristics and what they are and how difficult it is to define them, completely sidestepping that in the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and mention him early on before we continue talking. I don't know a lot about Charles Murray, but Charles Murray wrote that book, The Bell Curve, and he had a chapter about this, and it got him into a lot of trouble, but nobody... The only person I ever saw make an attempt to really grapple with it recently, because it's an older book, and I haven't tracked it for a long time, was Sam Harris. Sam Harris had him on his podcast and talked about some of these things, and Sam got a lot of flack just for speaking with him. Not that, if somebody has an idea that you find repulsive or repugnant, and you want to debate that person, Sam wasn't even debating him necessarily, but... just like, if you don't like the ideas, and that person's available to talk to that person, and you can work it out maybe, and figure out what exactly they are saying instead of assuming what they're saying. But I'm getting sidetracked. But that has not stopped many Americans from believing that genes cause racial discrimination. Blah, blah, blah. I know it's threatening, said Brian Donovan, a science educator researcher at the nonprofit BSCS Science Learning, who is leading the study. The thing to remember is that kids are already making sense of race and biology, but with no guidance. Human population geneticists have long emphasized that racial disparities found in society do not in themselves indicate corresponding genetic differences. Yes. I was going to point out, like, if you have different populations in Europe, and people commonly say things about, like, people's attitudes regarding mercantile might have more to do with, like, their naval tradition, geography, or culture. For example, the English and the Dutch versus the Germans and the German work ethic. And, like, people are attributed with these, like, oh, you are from this group, you might have these characteristics. And I feel like in a lot of cases that can be attributed to culture. But in some cases, it might have to do with genes, and it's hard to say. Like, I look at Ireland, what's the word for it? There are heritable characteristics that you can get from your parents. And I think one example, and this is kind of a negative example, but like, alcoholism is prevalent in certain populations, Irish, and you could say, you can make a convincing argument that would be a cultural thing. You could also make I don't know what a convincing argument about the genetics would be. I'm not sure how you prove that, honestly. But hopefully, these classes would be, if there is something of merit in that argument, these classes would allow students to discern the truth of that instead of saying, well, because it makes us uncomfortable, let's steer away from that completely, and it's all nurture, nurture, nurture. But I don't think that's what this argument, this article, is saying. So I'll just keep reading and stop talking for a minute. Let's see. A recent paper by leading researchers in the field invokes statistical models to argue that health disparities between black and white Americans are more readily explained by environmental effects, such as racism, than the DNA they inherited from ancestors. I would agree with that, except it's not racism. Not necessarily. Like, that's what I don't like about this. Health disparities caused by racism? I mean, you could have people, like, again, with the Irish, they tend to drink a lot. I look at the black community and the prevalence of, like, diabetes, for example. Patrice O'Neill, wonderful comedian, died before he hit 50. I think he was in his early 40s. I think he was maybe like 43, 44. Diabetes. And a lot of people in the entertainment industry that I followed, Fife from Tribe Called Quest, I think that was also diabetes. I don't know if Busta has diabetes. But yeah, there's just like a lot of people that have these health problems, and I don't think you get diabetes from racism, honestly. But I think there's a breakdown of that, like what foods you have available, what you were raised on, dietary choices, all those kinds of things. That can intersect with culture, and sometimes that has to do with race differences, maybe. Or sometimes that's just, what you eat. I don't know. Americans are more readily explained, yet there is a rising concern that genetic misconceptions are playing into divisive American attitudes about race. In a 2018 survey of 721 students from affluent majority white high schools, I'm already not liking the framing of this, Donovan found that 1 in 5 agreed with statements such as members of one racial group are more ambitious than members of another racial group because of genetics. That's very vague. A similar percentage of white American adults attribute the black-white income gap to genetic differences, according to an estimate by a team of sociologists published this fall. Although rarely acknowledged in debates over affirmative action or polling responses, belief in genetic causes of racial inequality remains widespread in the United States, wrote Anne Morning of the New York University and her colleagues. Donovan has argued that grade school biology classes may offer the only opportunity to dispel unfounded genetic explanations for racial inequality on a mass scale. Middle schools and high schools are the first and perhaps the only place that most Americans are taught about genetics. I'm going to cut in again. I'm just going to say, if people are promoting genetic explanations for why people differ, and that is wrong or manipulative, I think also referring to the culture in such a way and blaming everything on racism becomes insufferable. There are other reasons, and I feel like the lack of scruples in the social sciences potentially leads to a backlash where people will make explanations about things based on genetics and they don't know what they're talking about. But at the same time, social scientists are doing the same thing, where they're just being like, racism. Like, for example, I'm just going to put this out here, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm looking at, like, going back to the thing I was saying about the prevalence of diabetes. I don't think that's a genetic thing. It might be a cultural thing. It might be if somebody is raised, I don't know about the specific people I mentioned, but just in general, if you are raised by a single mother and she doesn't have time to prepare a meal for you because she's working and taking care of the household, and she keeps, for example, like packaged goods around the house that don't expire, like Ho-Hos, Twinkies, juices, sweet things, and you just stock the house with that, that's going to affect your health. And that might just be a food choice made from convenience because of your circumstances. I'm just going to put that out there as a theory, and that theory is not entirely predicated on racism, and I think it kind of makes sense, and it's not so nebulous. But I just get tired of the racism crusade. To continue, new curriculum knowledge is that there are minor genetic differences between geographic populations loosely correlated to today's racial categories, but the unit also conveys what geneticists have reiterated. People inherit their environment and culture with their genes, and it is a daunting task to disentangle them. Yes, agree 100%. So somebody needs to put a muzzle on these people, these social scientists that are always being like, racism, racism, racism. It's like, well, yeah, but things are more complicated than that. So if you're coming from the social perspective or from the genetic perspective, maybe hold your horses a little bit. To continue. A key part of the curriculum, Donovan said, is teaching students to understand the limits of our knowledge. Agreed, unless you're a social scientist, and then you can just spout a narrative. In the pilot study that helped Donovan secure a research grant in the National Science Foundation, students in 8 classrooms exposed to a rudimentary version of the curriculum were less likely than others to endorse statements suggesting that racial groups have defining qualities that are determined by genes. The new study will measure the curriculum's effect on such attitudes by asking students to fill out surveys before and after each unit. If that is used as a tool to measure a decrease in students' racism, that is a failure. That is, again, the wheedling and conniving of social scientists. But I don't know if that's necessarily the intent here. But it kind of seems to be. The training exercise, which a reporter attended attended on the condition that names would be withheld to avoid jeopardizing the study, showed what it might take to offer students, as one Colorado teacher put it, something better than "don't worry about it, we're 99% the same." The lessons are structured around 2 fictional teenagers, Robin and Taylor, who understand that the differences between the DNA in any 2 people make up 1/10 of 1% of their genome. But they disagree about how those differences intersect with race. Taylor thinks that there are genetic differences between people, but that those differences are not associated with race. Robin thinks that the genetic differences within a racial group are small, and that most genetic differences exist between people of different races. The truth is that neither has a completely accurate view. As human populations spread around the globe with people living in relative isolation for millennia, some differences emerged, but genetic variation between groups, say in Africa and Europe, are much smaller than the differences between each group. End of article. So, there's certain things in that article, I read it, and I go, you know what, I like that. That seems very reasonable. Teaching students to understand the limits of our knowledge. That's important. Also, shielding people from the good intentions of how to put this. Kids are already making sense of race and biology, but with no guidance. So, yeah, limit your guidance. Limit your guidance a little bit, because when they're talking about, I'll go back to this particle. I'm role-playing. I'll go back to this thoron particle. In the pilot study that helped Donovan secure a research grant from the National Science Foundation, students in 8 classrooms exposed to a rudimentary version of the current curriculum were less likely than others to endorse statements suggesting that racial groups have defining qualities that are determined by genes. The new study will measure the curriculum's effect on such attitudes by asking students to fill out surveys before and after the unit. So, I would be interested in seeing those surveys. I feel like if you had it graded on a scale of that sort of nature-nurture, like what is caused by genes and what is caused by acculturation, and people can have opinions about those things, and then the student could see their results and see, well, it seems like I have the idea that genes affect more, or culture affects more, and you shouldn't necessarily stigmatize either of those views. But I think the environment that we have now says nurture, 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 have the right values. But don't ask me to define those values, but have the right values. And it's like, it is a mix. So there were parts of that article I liked where it said there's, you know, a limit to our knowledge, but I just like the attitude of moving away from more of the social science and leaving things more open and giving kids guidance, but also giving them some space where you're not cramming assumptions about acculturation or about genes down their throat. And that is a challenge, and I'd be interested to see in how successful this is. And when you're reading about this in the newspaper, there wasn't really a lot wrong with that article. It's just that certain things trigger me when they're like, oh, we're just going to blame it on race. This is about racism, which is, you know, a part of it. Certainly happens. I just keep rambling on. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting article. I enjoyed reading it. And it was something unusual to see in the newspaper, so that was, I don't know if I'd describe it as refreshing, but as I had mentioned before, I've listened to people's perspectives on this and found some of them very interesting, some of them kind of unconvincing. There are some people that I've listened to, and they will take a very hard line about how genes affect, like, you know, we have an aggregate of certain populations, and we can say that, you know, if you come from this geography, then we can assume that your IQ is below this threshold and blah, 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 and therefore, do we want to implement this social policy? And that just seems very blunt force to me, and not responsible. I'm not going to call out any names, but there's certain people I'm thinking of in particular, and I don't like that, but I actually, like, I appreciate the candor. Like, you will say something like that, and it kind of makes you sound a certain way. Which might not necessarily be the case. Oh, I'm just talking vaguely at this point. I'm gonna get another cup of coffee, but thanks for listening. This is Sulak from the Purple Room, signing off.